Gotta have fast feet. Get up. Excellent. Give me feet. Come on. Stay with it. And down.
Early 2000s, I was living in Northern California, trying to finally graduate from my third college, the prestigious 1987 Playboy Party School of the Year, Chico State. I worked on an ambulance for a while, worked at a couple of bike shops. I was doing website design. I was running a small publishing company that didn't really make any money. I did occasional subsidy publishing jobs, just, different things I could figure out to make money while I had no idea what to do with my life. Late 2003, right as I was about to make the terrible mistake of going to grad school, just through an odd series of coincidences, I met a guy named Rob Wolf who had just opened a little gym with his future wife, Nikki. And they needed a website and were looking to trade the job for training, of course, because they had no money. At that time, I just had a bar and a power rack in my apartment bedroom and just no direction at all as an athlete anymore, which was becoming somewhat of an existential crisis by then. So I jumped at the invitation to train with them, and pretty quickly after that, they asked me to become a partner in the gym. And of course, I jumped on that too because it seemed a lot more appealing to me than more school or making $6.25 an hour on an ambulance. Eventually, we moved into a bigger space that had less diesel exhaust and metal shavings in the atmosphere. And then we put out the first issue of the Performance Menu Journal in February 2005, which was a really good use for Rob's big brain and connections and my editing, design, and publishing experience. And yes, it's easy to forget, but at that time, a PDF magazine was pretty cutting edge. All three of us had to keep working other jobs alongside of the gym business because it wasn't really making any money. So I was still working at a bike shop early on and then kept doing web design and book editing and publishing the whole time. So by 2006, I was getting a little bored, but mainly just really burned out with the gym because the three of us were working all day, every day with other jobs, while people with, $3,000 carbon fiber road bikes dressed head to toe in Patagonia gear were nickel and diming us on already low membership fees that didn't pay our bills. And I don't remember consciously thinking it at the time, but the desire to make some kind of change was definitely around at that point. I'd been doing nutrition for one of Mike Bergner's weightlifters, Amy, for a while by then, and when he came through town on a motorcycle trip, I asked him if he'd coach me if I moved to Southern California. And he said yes with what I'm sure was zero belief I would actually do it, because I'm sure he had heard that a million times before. But joke was on him, because within a few months I had traded my third of the gym business to Rob and Nikki for their 2/3 of the Performance Menu Journal, packed up all my stuff and driven down to San Diego County to try to be a real weightlifter. Right after I got there in August 2006, I established the Catalyst Athletics LLC. I didn't have the idea of running a business focused on Olympic weightlifting. I don't remember the thought process exactly, but I'm pretty sure it didn't even occur to me as a viable possibility because No one at that time was doing anything like that. Even the best weightlifting coaches in the country all had real jobs and just coached on the side. And there was virtually nothing online about weightlifting. You couldn't even find videos or even photos of a snatch or a clean and jerk on USA Weightlifting's website. So there was definitely no precedent, at least that I was aware of, for actually earning a living as a weightlifting coach in the US, and definitely not with an online business dedicated to Olympic weightlifting. So the company initially was basically just a container for the performance menu and the personal training practice I needed to pay bills while I played weightlifter. I already had a bit of an audience at this point from the performance menu and running a fairly well-known gym, and more of the interactions I was having with people became focused on weightlifting, and people were coming to me for help with lifting, and I must have been doing at least a decent job because they kept coming back and more people kept coming. And it didn't really take too long for me to recognize that I had a lot more potential as a coach than as a weightlifter. I was pushing the performance menu more into the training and specifically weightlifting side of things instead of it being more focused on nutrition like it was originally. I'd started putting out weightlifting content on the website, and I was posting free daily workouts that were attracting a decent following. And I had taught Amy how to do some layout work, so she was now doing the issue layouts for the journal. Right around that time, the founder and still then CEO of CrossFit, Greg Glassman, called me and actually tried to buy the performance menu. And based on what had happened when we first launched it, it was pretty obvious he wanted to buy it just to get rid of it. And aside from the principle of it all, I was relying on that income to live, and I knew Glassman sure wasn't going to offer me early retirement level money, so I of course told him no. At some point in 2007, I got some requests to do a seminar, and in spite of understanding my qualifications for that were questionable at best, I ended up arranging one and actually filled it, and thankfully got a good response. So I ended up doing another 3 or 4 around the country with Amy helping during that time I was still in San Diego. Right around that same time, I told Bergner that he needed to write a book. So there were a few out there, but nothing that could really get someone with no experience started in the sport. It was like just a lot of piecemeal information that always assumed a basic working knowledge of the sport and the movements. And I'd had neither of those as a teenager trying to figure things out before the internet existed. So I was envisioning something that, anyone could pick up and use to learn how to snatch and clean and jerk from step 0. I told him I'd ghostwrite the whole thing and I'd even publish it through Catalyst. He wouldn't really have to do anything. I knew how he taught the lifts, how he coached generally, so it wasn't going to be hard. All I really needed from him was some time discussing the programming section, just so I could make sure that I was getting something down that, accurately represented what he did. A couple months later, I'd written the entire book except the programming part, and I think we had maybe 1 session trying to get that organized, and then pretty soon after that, he told me he didn't want to do a book. So now I've done all this work organizing and trying to figure out how to present this information as effectively as possible, imagining my clueless 15-year-old self trying to learn it. And, obviously I still saw a real need for this kind of book. That hadn't changed. So I don't remember the timeline exactly. It must have been pretty brief, but I decided to just write my own book, and I got Bergner's support to do it. I was very much aware that I really had no business at that point writing a book on Olympic weightlifting because, it was effectively claiming a level of expertise that I hadn't earned. But I believed someone had to write this book, and no one else more qualified was doing it, and the state of things at that time sure didn't make it seem likely. So I rewrote and expanded the book with my own approach, put it out September 2008, and then, pretty much just crossed my fingers that I wouldn't be publicly humiliated, especially by all the coaches I looked up to. Luckily, I actually got a ton of support from them right from the start, and I think earned a bit of respect, which then created more opportunities for me to learn from them. And I also think it gave me some credibility right out of the gate because I had their support. And it really quickly took off, sold really well, got a lot of good feedback, and obviously I didn't know it at the time, But basically, I had just accidentally written what turned out to be the most successful Olympic weightlifting book in history. And I think that's what really laid the groundwork for everything else that followed. Sometime early 2008, Amy and I moved in together. Catalyst was picking up a bit of momentum. The book was doing well. The website audience was growing. I kept putting out more content. We'd put out some instructional posters as kind of like a companion to the book. And we were doing seminars pretty regularly around the country. Amy and I were both still lifting competitively, and she just recently won the national championships. But around this time, Bergner was pretty ready to be done coaching serious lifters. So we started talking about the possibility of opening our own gym. I had taken her up to visit San Francisco Bay Area, where I grew up, a couple times, and she really loved it. And it seemed like the kind of place we'd be able to run a gym successfully. So I started looking at commercial properties up there, and I think by November or October maybe, we'd found a building for the gym, a house to rent, and we headed up. We found a 5,000 square foot former machine shop, and I built it out with 6 platforms and a bunch of just flexible open space with rubber matting that we could use for the non-weightlifting stuff, but also as overflow for lifting if needed. At that time, I wasn't aware of any commercial weightlifting gyms, like gyms that served Olympic weightlifting as an actual successful business model. The best coaches in the country were training their lifters out of their garages or through high school or city rec programs. So, we knew an actual weightlifting gym as a business wasn't something we'd be able to do. So the idea we had was essentially to use a general fitness and personal training business to subsidize a weightlifting team, at least as a way to get it started. Absolutely banked on our existing reputation to bring in members, and luckily it worked because we did not have another plan. So we ended up having a pretty decent group of members right after opening. We had local lifters training there almost right away, but a lot of them were just drop-ins from other teams when we opened the gym up on Saturdays for a big lifting session. But we slowly started building our own weightlifting team, which was the whole point of the gym. I'd been working in the background this whole time on the second edition of my book, and that came out in September of 2009, which did seem really quick, but it was a lot of improvement that really needed to get done. I kept putting out more articles and videos, so the website kept growing. I built a pretty extensive video exercise library around then also, which, as far as I know, was the first Olympic weightlifting specific one out there. We never had anything that could be fairly described as a business plan. That's why I always laugh when people ask me for advice. But I think I just figured that pumping out a ton of quality, helpful content and making almost all of it free was a pretty solid growth strategy. And, conveniently enough, it aligned with my naturally low sense of self-worth and constitutional discomfort with asking people to pay me. So, we just chugged along like this, really just relying on the online content and the growing reputation from that to get people into the gym and throw some change in our hats here and there. Sometime in 2012, I got the bright idea to make a documentary about the sport of weightlifting in the US, possibly the least popular sport in the country. So, not exactly a film the general public was clamoring for, but we were already building a business on something no one cared about, so why not? Really, the only problem was that I had zero experience with filmmaking, no suitable equipment, and no money. So the editing software I had was Final Cut Express. It was like the free version of the real thing that just came with Macs and was just a stripped down with bare minimum functionality. The cameras I had at the time were a digital SLR that only shot stills, and the video camera I had shot interlaced 480 on mini DV tape. So in other words, a quarter of the resolution that's considered normal now, and it was digital, but it was on tape. Most of the video creators I know these days have never captured video from tape to edit in their lives, and probably half of them don't even realize that that was a thing. Like, that's how you used to have to get footage from your camera. Bought a wireless lav mic, got a cheap tripod, and I made a reflector by gluing the windshield sun protector from my truck onto a piece of foam board because I couldn't afford lights. And that was the whole setup initially. Partway through the process, I was able to buy a camera that shot the original HD 1080p format. So, I thought it was pretty big league then. Flew around the country, mostly West Coast, because that's what I could afford, and those are the coaches I knew personally for the most part. Interviewed some great coaches, shot lifting footage in their gyms, and then did my best with my very vague working knowledge of how documentaries worked to piece something together that I hoped would be interesting to someone other than just me. And obviously I couldn't afford to license real music. I couldn't even afford lights and cameras. Aside from an intro and outro song that I found for dirt cheap on one of the early royalty-free websites, I scored the rest of it myself, although to be fair, that's a pretty generous term for what I did. I knew enough to shoot all the footage from the start in 24 frames to make it look more cinematic. But the problem I discovered way too late was that the free Final Cut software could only edit in 30 frames. So not only did that mean I wasn't getting 24 frame footage, but that it actually looked even worse than if I had just shot it in 30 because the bad frame rate conversion, and plus the fact that it was shot some of it in 480i and some in 1080p. So, it was a bit of a train wreck, but I just did whatever I could after the fact to make it look less video-y. But more than 10 years later, I'm still bitter about it. Especially, these days, like the cameras, the editing software, all the things I needed to do a completely professional job are just normal, affordable, consumer level products that every 11-year-old YouTuber has. I mean, I could have shot that thing on the current iPhone and it would have looked more professional than it did using, the gear that I had available at that time. So anyway, I did what I could to put together a final product that I could at least live with. We did a premiere at a small theater in the Bay Area in November 2013. Put it out on DVD. It was on a few streaming platforms, still is on some. And it definitely didn't make us any money, but it was a good experience. And I'm glad I was the first to do it, if nothing else. I'm glad I got it done. And after 10 years, I just put it on YouTube for free, so now everyone can sit there and watch it and complain about the resolution from their filmmaking capable phones. During all this time, the lifting team's growing pretty steadily, becoming pretty successful, consistently medaling at national competitions. Catalyst kept gaining a reputation as a legit source for Olympic lifting information. I kept putting it out at a pretty insane rate, articles, videos, DVDs, continuing to publish the performance menu every month, which was coming up on its 10-year anniversary at that point. So, 120 issues. And I was still traveling for seminars several times a year in and out of the US. And I ended up training a couple of my lifters to be able to run them so I could send them to do the international ones. because I was just at that point, too busy, too exhausted for it, and I just did the US ones. In 2014, our landlords basically forced us to move into a different building. At least it was only across the parking lot, but it's still a huge hassle and an unnecessary expense. And I liked the original space a lot better, but whatever. Luckily we had a good team of lifters who helped us get it done, and we were also able to paint it, which is where the signature gray walls for Catalyst came from. Amy and I were both still lifting competitively, which for me at least was getting pretty difficult with my age and being too busy and coaching 12 to 15 lifters at the same meets I was lifting in. Amy had made a world team a couple years prior, but had to withdraw because of an injury. And she was just trying to keep up with training along with all of her growing responsibilities. And she was starting to coach more athletes too. So it was harder and harder for both of us. I've been working on the third edition of my book, added something like 100,000 words plus probably 300 or 400 photos. And that came out January 2016, and that book just kept going. At that point, I knew it was being used in a number of college courses around the country. It had been translated into a few different languages, and so it was pretty solidly established as the standard. Even still then, there really wasn't much action online for Olympic weightlifting, which definitely helps book sales because people have fewer options. Social media was a thing, but not anything even close to what it's like now. So I was still really far out front in terms of content creation, and I was amassing this huge archive through the website. Made it easy to keep it all organized for people to actually find what they were looking for, which wasn't something social media platforms could do, and they still don't do it well. And then, of course, that huge collection of content is a bunch of data for search engines, so the website just crushed it on searches for weightlifting topics, so it kept growing. The only reason I was able to get that much done and build that kind of infrastructure for all the content is that I did it all myself. Not just like writing, shooting videos, but editing, publishing, graphic design, the website programming, every single thing, because I just happened to have all that experience and was finally putting it to good use. That meant that not only was it all exactly what I wanted, and that the functionality of stuff like the website was way better than anything out there because it was just totally customized to the purpose, but we could have never afforded to pay people to do all that work. I remember around that same time getting quotes for a website rebuild because I was busy, I didn't want to do it, and I was getting quotes for like $50,000 to $60,000, and they were telling me they wouldn't even replicate all the current functionality. So obviously I'm just gonna keep doing it myself for free and make something better anyway. Either way, I never wanted to run some lame corporation, with a bunch of employees and managers and contractors. I'm in business for myself because I want to do it, not pay other people to do it for me. And plus, I always just wanted a small operation that could steer instantly however I wanted and not be beholden to anybody or have to depend on other people to let me do these things. So, having this odd collection of seemingly unrelated experiences and skills made it possible to build something, bigger and faster with no money really, than could have ever been done otherwise. I think at least at that time, before desktop publishing and print on demand were really around, and video wasn't such a normal, easy thing that everyone was doing. And in order to have a really incredible website, you had to actually build it. You know, you had to code it yourself instead of, you know, clicking a few buttons and having this instant thing pop up, or have some, you know, AI robot build it for you. The problem was that it meant I was working at, you know, a stupid pace that I knew wasn't sustainable long term, but it was effective. And I knew I had a unique opportunity that I didn't want to blow. So I just put my head down and kept going. Business was growing, the team was growing, our reputation was growing. So, you know, everything was going great, except for the fact that Amy and I absolutely hated the gym business. By early 2016, Amy and I were at a point where we were just beyond sick of running a gym. The costs in the area had shot up because it was turning into what everyone knows now as Silicon Valley. So our already tight margins were disappearing completely, and our own employees couldn't even afford to live there anymore. It had just kind of turned into this unrelenting push to bring in clients, which has nothing to do with coaching. And then it made no sense as a weightlifting gym anymore, considering weightlifters have no money. So there was no way, you know, athletes would be able to relocate there to join the team. So we knew we needed to make some kind of serious change. And at that time, remote coaching wasn't really happening a whole lot. I had a couple remote athletes, Amy had one, but it wasn't a commonplace thing like it is now with all the apps and the software to support it. And it wasn't something that athletes and coaches were so accustomed to. So we still needed a physical location lifters could train in. It just couldn't be in such an expensive area, and we didn't want to be in an actual commercial gym business anymore. So we decided we wanted to move somewhere we could, you know, get out of the crowd, have some property, and work from home, including coaching our lifters, which meant a garage or an outbuilding of some kind, but just a private facility for our own team. We knew our current team lifters wouldn't be coming with us, but we could continue coaching them remotely. We had enough experience with it to know we could make it work if the athletes were willing to do it. And getting rid of the gym business would free up so much of my time and energy for making the content that Catalyst was built on and known for, and, you know, really was the source of our income. Plus, we could get by with one part-time admin employee instead of having such a huge payroll with multiple trainers. The gym, especially by that time, was barely profitable, definitely more of a drain on time and energy and focus than anything productive. And, you know, obviously it served an important purpose early on, helping us establish ourselves as coaches and build a team, but it was way more of a liability than anything else by that time. Our daughter was going to start high school that fall, so we felt like we either had to, you know, pull the trigger right away or wait 4 years so she didn't have to move in the middle of high school and then hate us until she was 25. So we started looking with the idea that we'd probably wait the 4 years, but we found a place that we fell in love with, had a massive garage so we wouldn't have to build anything. And, you know, the idea of slogging through 4 more years of that misery was just too much now that we saw this clear alternative. So we pulled the trigger, bought a house in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. When I posted what we were doing online, people actually thought it was a joke. And, you know, the gym members were pretty unhappy, of course, and we didn't love that part of it, but we also knew we couldn't make our decision based on keeping local clients happy. The national championships that year was coming up in late spring, so we scheduled the gym shutdown right before that. And the idea was that we could start breaking the place down to get ready to move, but keep it functional enough for the team to continue training into the competition. Team ended up winning the national championships that year, so that was a really cool way to kind of close out that era. and make it seem like it wasn't a waste of time and money, which is what it had started to feel like a lot of the time in those days as I was sitting in my office pulling my hair out, not being able to do what I really needed and wanted to do. Once we got back from nationals, we raced to get the gym broken down the rest of the way, packed up the house, and then drove 11 hours or so up to the new place. I was definitely excited to get rid of the gym and start something new, but at the same time, I was genuinely worried about the possibility that I wouldn't be able to coach lifters anymore without having a gym. And of course, Amy had tried to assure me it'd be fine, but I was convinced that I would turn into one of those TV doctors who's giving everyone advice but hasn't even seen a patient in 20 years. I didn't want to just be like an internet personality telling people what to do without the credibility of being an active coach. But of course, by that point, we were beyond fully committed. So I just figured, like always, we'd find a way to make it work. We got to Oregon in mid-June, and first priority for me after getting the absolute basics of my office set up was getting the garage turned into a gym while Amy got the house sorted out. We'd hired someone to level the entire floor before we moved, and we had almost the entire collection of gear from a 5,000 square foot gym piled up in there. Amy and I both came from a garage as lifters. She started in Olympic weightlifting in a garage. I grew up lifting in a garage, and it was the kind of environment we both liked. There's something special about it that you can't replicate in a commercial gym. And obviously any gym's atmosphere is determined in large part by the people in it, but a garage gym tends to attract the kind of athletes who contribute to that atmosphere that we want. And the environment itself definitely does have an influence. Like, you can put the same band in an arena and then in a bar, and those are two completely different experiences, even with the exact same songs. But it also seemed so uniquely American in the best of ways. For years I'd kind of looked at the national sports system of these dominant weightlifting countries as something to aspire to, like it was the model that we all needed to try to emulate here. But the longer I did it, the more I recognized that one of the biggest reasons I fell in love with weightlifting was the circumstances in which it was done, right? It was this underground, underappreciated, hardcore sport that only the most passionate and dedicated people were willing to do. And I mean, that's essentially what the American weightlifting documentary was about. And once you bring in the money and the flash and the pretty facilities and the fancy media team and the glamour, it just seems a lot less interesting to me. So going back to the garage was like our way of trying to recapture and almost institutionalize this history and this unique aspect of the sport here. The team came up for a training camp in August, and we got a feel for how it would all work. And it's kind of the best of both worlds. We get a chance to coach our athletes in person, they get the coaching and the atmosphere and the energy of their teammates, and then they leave. And we have time and energy for other work until the next camp. So it's valuable and even invigorating for everyone, but it also keeps the freedom and the flexibility in place. Amy had retired from lifting and she was coaching more, and she was putting lifters on international teams, so she became only the second female coach in the US to earn the senior international coach credential, and then later she became the first and is still the only American woman to coach a lifter in the Olympics with Maddie Rogers. So eventually we ended up each coaching about half the lifters on the team. So, managing these big national meets became a lot easier because we were essentially splitting the stress. And I'd retired from lifting after blowing out my shoulder at the 2015 Nationals, so that also made coaching at meets a lot easier. Getting rid of the gym was exactly the massive weight off our shoulders we expected it to be. I could spend my days doing what I felt was useful work instead of being suffocated by marketing and promotion and the general discontent of that whole business, and have the flexibility to schedule my days essentially however I wanted. Toward the end of that first year, a lifter named Lily moved here to train with me, but being in the gym with her once a day, 5 days a week, was still way less time than I'd been stuck in the gym previously. And most of the time I was actually able to train with her since it was only the two of us, so that saved a ton of time also. Amy took on more remote athletes and clients. For a while, she was coaching some youth lifters and CrossFitters out of the gym. And so we just gradually figured out how to make the new system work better and better as we went. So with this newfound time and energy and some fresh inspiration from the change of environment and not being stuck in a business I absolutely hated, I got back to work building my silly little weightlifting content empire from the new remote compound. And then COVID arrived. Purely through coincidence, we were already out of the gym business. So we were really lucky to not take that financial hit like a lot of other people did. And, actually we were in a really good position during that time because everything we were doing was already online. So we already had all the infrastructure in place. Our customers' access to us never changed. And I think it actually ended up pushing a lot of new people to us because we were there and able to provide options when, their normal sources couldn't. Right after lockdown started happening, I started posting, no equipment home workouts on Instagram for people to use. I started doing live Q&As every week as, a way to connect with people and try to help them feel like they were still part of some kind of community, that they were still part of this weightlifting world in spite of maybe being stuck in their apartments all day, every day, and probably climbing the walls without being able to lift. Then in 2021, COVID restrictions had started getting lifted for the most part. Amy had the idea to start offering training camps to the public instead of just having them for our own team. And I'd already slowed way down on doing seminars before COVID really hit because the travel was just so draining and I was too busy. So this was a potential alternative that would let us coach people in person without having to travel. My initial thought was that there was no way anyone would pay for something like that. More expensive than a seminar, plus travel to an inconvenient location, didn't strike me as a winning formula. But thankfully it turned out I was completely wrong about it, and we started doing camps regularly and selling every single one of them out. And it was just a totally different experience for everyone from seminars. They got to come spend time in a cool gym that they saw online all the time and get coaching from people they otherwise would never have access to. And Amy and I got to enjoy that kind of coaching again, which is a lot different than coaching your own team lifters, especially remotely. And it was that garage gym experience again. These people were literally in our home, and it makes it much more personal and meaningful for everyone, I think. That same year, Amy and I got to be the first married couple to both be coaching lifters at the World Championships, when she had 2 Americans and I had an American, a Canadian, and a Dane competing in Uzbekistan. So that was a pretty fun experience, and just another one of those things that was unique about what we were doing. The team kept growing with both American and international lifters as remote coaching became more mainstream and our reputation and reach really grew. And I quit working with private clients completely and used that time instead to run some low-cost online teams as another way to give more people access to at least some level of coaching from me. And I like being able to interact with such a huge number of people, both to some extent on a personal level, but also because it's a massive number of athletes to be able to learn from as a coach. And Amy and I are really lucky now to be in a position where we can say no more. And the biggest thing we say no to now are athletes. So we get to be really picky about who we coach. And that's let us build a really incredible team that isn't just good lifters, but good people that we genuinely like being around. Instead of just being coaches who try to collect a stable of great athletes, regardless of who they are as people and how they affect a team dynamic, and being miserable dealing with people we don't like just for the sake of collecting coaching accomplishments. So Catalyst's success has allowed us to do things like that, which means it's a lot easier to enjoy coaching because we're not hostage to athletes we can't stand but have to work with for the sake of money or reputation or whatever else. Now with social media being the dominant platform for content, that's what so much of my time and energy goes into. And it's frustrating in a lot of ways because kind of like running the gym business, you're forced to put so much time and energy into things that aren't really directly related to what you're trying to do, which for me is help lifters and coaches be better at what they do. And it makes it really tough for me to work on big projects like books. Because it takes so much time and creative energy, but also it makes it really hard to set aside the big extended chunks of time you need to be able to work on something like a 250,000 word book. So now instead of constantly trying to get clients through the door of a gym, I'm just relentlessly pumping out perishable content. But at the same time, it allows me to access more people in more ways. So I do my best to not have a bad attitude about it and use it in a way that's beneficial for everyone, and just avoid as much of the silliness as I can. I try to put out content that's as close to me coaching someone face to face as possible, rather than trying to create some persona and check all the algorithm boxes. And I keep updating the website as these platforms constantly change, to allow me to archive and organize all that content as well as possible, so it doesn't actually disappear and can stay useful indefinitely. And that at least makes it feel like a much better use of time. I'm very aware that my approach means I'll never be the most popular guy on social media, but it also means I believe in what I'm doing, which is providing education rather than cleverly crafted content to game the system. Focusing on being better at coaching and teaching instead of just being better at social media. And I would much rather genuinely help fewer people and cultivate the kind of community I want to be a part of than just get in front of more eyes however possible. I want to coach, even if it's in an odd format like social media, not put on a show for some kind of weird digital applause. And it's gratifying to see people really getting something valuable out of what I'm doing, instead of it just being another thing they absent-mindedly look at for a few seconds before, moving on to the next jingling set of keys. I have no idea how long we'll remain relevant and be able to keep doing this. And the longer we do it, the closer I realize we're getting to the time when we become old news. And to be honest, we don't really have a contingency plan for when people get sick of us. So I'm just gonna keep doing things the way I wanna do them. And I guess hope that the positive influence I've tried to have will outlast people's interest in us personally. I would like to think that if Catalyst shut down right now, that we've already had enough of an impact on the sport and on people around the world personally that I could be content with our contribution and what I guess you could call a legacy. But who knows? All of this stuff seems so temporary these days. I guess you could say I am moderately optimistic, but unconvinced. "20 years now after I started it without any real idea of what I was doing, and Amy and I largely just stumbling our way through it a lot of the time, I feel like Catalyst Athletics is finally what it was meant to be. And it was never supposed to be a gym business or a paid super team of mercenary lifters or a sterile corporate operation just focused on making money or a social media empire. It was always just meant to be a couple of coaches and their athletes in a garage with the doors wide open.